Hello and welcome to How We Coach. I'm Tom.
And I'm Jack, and today we are talking about accountable leadership.
We used to have no problem claiming responsibility for our successes when the teams that we coached won.
However, when we lost, we fell into the trap of blaming others. We certainly didn't consider ourselves as one of the reasons for the team's failure.
But then we changed our perspective. Instead, we began to take much more accountability.
This was heavily influenced by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin's book, Extreme Ownership.
Today we're going to look at why we made the change,
How we now use accountable leadership.
and the outcomes that we've observed since making the change.
Tom, please start us off with those whys.
Before using accountable leadership, we weren't sufficiently preparing our teams.
Come the end of a loss, we would account the blame to anything but ourselves. We would say things like,
The team never got going, did they? But, to be fair, it was early in the season.
wow, that pitch was terrible, but to be fair, there's not a lot we can do about that.
The referee was awful. That was never a penalty.
We were looking to always shift the blame elsewhere, rather than critically reflecting on how we could improve.
So, how did we become accountable leaders?
First, we had to understand what accountable leadership meant to us.
We define accountable leadership as assessing our part in the problem and then finding the best possible solution.
This was a big change in mindset for us. Instead of blaming others, we took ownership of the problems ourselves.
We realised that a lot of the problems that we faced were due to our lack of preparation.
We needed to take accountability. An example of this was at a game of tag rugby.
The referee made lots of variable decisions and disheartened our team. It really put them off.
We then told the players it was our fault because we hadn't prepared them for that situation.
So, the next week at training, we played a match situation where we would, as referees, make random decisions.
Their challenge was to play to the whistle, not argue, and keep their cool.
This way, our team was a lot better equipped to deal with random refereeing decisions in the future.
Next up, we quickly came to the realization that leading by example was powerful because the children were copying what we were doing.
Previously, we were guilty of not walking our talk.
For example, we always used to tell our teams that they should respect the decisions of the officials.
But we occasionally found ourselves challenging decisions on the sidelines.
As accountable leaders, we now know that we cannot ask our team to do anything if we are not willing to set the example ourselves.
As well as leading by example,
We realised that we were actually part of the problem ourselves.
because we were failing to address other issues properly.
For example, we used to have players turning up late to our training sessions.
We were part of the problem because we were saying, "Oh, not to worry," when people were late.
We realised that we had never explained to the parents before why lateness was an issue, so we sent them an email.
In the email, we explained the importance of coming to training on time. We've only got 45 minutes a week, so let's make the most of it.
We then saw an improvement in punctuality, and we even had people turning up early.
Importantly, if a child was late, we then made the change to say, well, we need to be here on time to make the most of our 45-minute session.
We learned that the behaviour we tolerated was the behaviour we tended to receive.
We found that another key aspect of accountable leadership is suppressing our egos.
Although this was initially hard to accept, we came to realise just how important this component is.
We noticed that subconsciously our arrogance was getting in the way of our long-term goals as a team.
This reflection was inspired by the book The Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday.
We put our egos to one side and we asked the children for feedback on our coaching.
This opened our eyes to some of the things the children weren't enjoying and some of the things that we, as coaches, could improve.
In one team, the children fed back to us that they would prefer us to talk less, and instead they wanted us to do a lot more demonstrations that were practical.
So, by removing our egos, gathering and acting upon their feedback was made a lot easier.
Just as John Wooden said, you must be interested in finding the best way, not in having your own way.
Further to managing our egos, we found that there is a very fine line between being accountable leaders and trying to control everything.
Influenced heavily by the Stoic philosophers, we realised that there are some things that we can't control, and that's okay.
They taught us that whilst we can't control external events, we can control our responses to them.
For example, we used to cancel rainy sessions or head under shelter, playing silly games, and actually wasted the sessions.
But now, we don't lament the weather and moan about it. We appreciate that what we have in our control is our ability to prepare a wet weather plan. If it rains, we simply head into the bag and use our backup plan.
Once we had a good grasp of the things that we could prepare for, we needed a process to address them.
Here is the process that we now use. We start by planning.
With timings, equipment, and key coaching points.
Next up, we coach.
We deliver the session, keeping to timings and making relevant changes where necessary.
Lastly, we reflect.
We record our reflections and thoughts on the session.
For example, we might note down that an activity went on for too long due to a lengthy explanation, or the behaviour at the start of the session wasn't great due to a boring warm-up.
Our reflections inform our planning and the process starts again.
This process allows us to measure our progress and keeps us focused on making consistent improvements.
Although this process was very helpful, we found ourselves getting stuck in the planning phase, not knowing which problems to address first.
This is when we took some big advice from Gary Keller in his book, The One Thing.
Gary identifies this as the key question to ask yourself. What is the one thing you can do such that by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary?
We now try to follow Gary's advice. Before planning a session, we will write out a to-do list based on our reflections from a previous session.
Here's a list of things that we wanted to improve in our football team. Passing the ball quicker, keeping calm under pressure, using positive communication, working together as a team, and shooting.
In our next training session, we decided to change one thing. We began with a team building activity.
This one thing helped our team improve, keeping calm under pressure, using positive communication, and working together as a team. It didn't solve everything, but we found this change made everything else easier.
Another fundamentally important aspect that allows us to be accountable leaders is making sure we pick the right leaders in our teams.
As Damien Hughes outlined in his book, The Barcelona Way, captains are really important in helping you communicate your messages when you're not there.
We can't be everywhere all the time, and when we're not there, we need a captain to lead in a similar way to us. In the past, we have fallen into the trap of appointing captains who are the most technically skilled players.
However, we found that some of these players didn't always exhibit the best behaviours for others to follow.
We now only choose captains who are able to lead by example.
We find that these captains have a much wider positive impact.
They help to improve others and not just themselves.
Lastly, we find it very important to maintain balance when being accountable leaders.
As Jocko Willink and Leif Babin's second book, The Dichotomy of Leadership, explains, when you take accountable leadership too far, it can go wrong.
We've got to have balance. So, we try to make sure that we take accountability whilst empowering others.
We lead by example whilst also being realistic with our expectations.
We remain firm but maintain flexibility where appropriate.
We reduce our egos without becoming passive.
Choose our leaders wisely but allow for their mistakes.
We reflect but avoid dwelling on mistakes. We have found that maintaining this balance is one of the hardest things to do as an accountable leader. We have found it to be like a tightrope at times.
However, when we find the balance, we feel empowered and we coach at our best. Now for the outcomes that we've observed.
Now we've made the change to become accountable leaders, we have found that we are much more able to effectively prepare our teams.
It's helped us to put things in place to prepare for situations that we can control.
We've also seen a reduction in the behaviours that we want to avoid, like lateness, for example.
And best of all, we now see children leading by example and being accountable for their own actions. There's a lot to cover in this topic, so we'll be leaving links in the description below. As they say, a leader is a reader, so do have a look at some of those books. We also dive deeper into this topic on our podcast, Team Talk with Tom and Jack. We really look forward to our next upload, which will be on our ethos, where once again, we're going to try and provide you with as much value as we can.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's upload, and all the links to our social media accounts are in the description below. We hope you do all of that YouTube tomfoolery with liking and subscribing.
I've been Tom.
And I have been Jack.
And this has been How We Coach.